This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. Today, I'm very fortunate to have Dr. Bernie Munk back with us to tell us more insightful things about government and corporations. Dr. Bernard Munk, without question, is the expert who has the credentials and experience to talk about the market, corporate governance, and attempts to bring value to corporations. His long career spans academia and public service. Over his long career, he has been the owner and operator of trading companies and also production companies. He has been financial advisor to private investors, hedge funds, and to family offices. I think that makes him a little knowledgeable. Bernie, I would be very grateful if you would tell us, have corporate governance gotten any better, gotten worse, remained the same? And one other thing, people all over the world feel a dissonance. They feel that government doesn't listen to them. It doesn't know their needs. Will you talk about those things, please?
It would be my pleasure. Let me just start with an incident of my own life. I left the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in 1969 after teaching at the University of Michigan and spending a year at the Fed. And I helped organize a company that invested in agricultural projects in developing countries. And my first job in the U.S. was managing our corporate cash. And
I wouldn't want to manage any corporate cash.
Well, we didn't have a lot of it, but
Yes.
what we didn't have as much business, and so the cash had to be managed. And I used to buy commercial paper offered by the banks and major corporations. In 1978 or 79. I'm sorry, 1968 or 69. I'm going back a long way. I was managing cash, and I used to buy corporate paper. And one of the pieces of paper I used to buy all the time was the Penn Central Railroad. And I don't know how I managed to have no commercial paper from the Penn Central Railroad when it went bankrupt.
Wow.
And I said, I thought this was a wonderful company. It was a great big railroad. I actually had worked for the Penn Central when I was in college for a part of a summer. No idea that corporations could simply have a huge hole that nobody knew about. So I learned something. The average investor doesn't look very deeply into what's going into the corporation. Now, over the years, corporate control has become a vast market for activist investors. And of course, the big change came in the 80s when Michael Milken began to create what is called a junk bond to finance the takeover of corporations that were not performing very well. I mean, it did a huge service for small independent entrepreneurs.
He also made junk bonds for corporations that were performing fairly well.
Well, some of them worked,
Yes.
some of them didn't.
Mm-hmm.
But because of his efforts, I was able to buy a set of businesses in the late 80s
Mm-hmm.
because we could get financing because it was considered possible to do these things. And
Yes.
we financed a leverage buyout of 3 companies in Pennsylvania, which we ran very successfully and ultimately sold the business. But my point is that one of Milken's great innovations was compensating managers for performance, so people got performance pay.
Mm-hmm.
But that in itself creates another problem, and that problem is that the managers are incentivized to take more risk than you might observe with conventional information systems. Now that's changed a lot. Today, managers are scrutinized by professional investors who run large funds, And if they suspect that something is going wrong, you can be sure an activist is going to try to change the board or change the management or take over the corporation. And let me just give you an example that this is not just in the United States. We have a massive fraud going on, uncovered in Germany today, called Wirecard. And we see all the same problems that we saw in the early 2000s when Enron and WorldCom failed, namely the dereliction of the supervisory and the other board. There are two boards in Germany. They didn't pay enough attention. And secondly, the auditors got fooled. Now, I have suggested long ago that auditors are not to be permanent fixtures on a corporation. They should be rotated. They should be rotated reasonably frequently.
Is there any interest in that idea?
Well, it has been debated in the Congress. It hasn't gotten to the point where the SEC forces a real change rotationally.
Yes.
But if you did that, if you think about what the impact would be, you would have auditors who worry about who the successor is going to be, because if the fraud happens on the second round, they're going to be blamed for not finding it in the first round. So their incentives change. And this really tells you about the power of incentives in regulating business. Now, the same kinds of problems occur in government. If you don't have liability assigned to the writers of legislation, the implementers, and the implementers of it, you have a peculiar world where you pass a law, but you're not responsible for the outcome, and you're not responsible for its administration. So, I think the same kinds of ideas would work in government if we had shorter periods of staying in the same office.
You know, you have a problem of people getting knowledge through experience.
Right.
And having term limits curtails that problem.
Well, that's exactly what was debated at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting to read Madison's notes, because he worried seriously. There were term limits in the Articles of Confederation, but he worried that it took time for people to be educated in the legislative process and the governing process, and that if they turned over too quickly, you wouldn't have enough experience. Well, it doesn't have to be that they go out every 2 years. It might be that you put term limits on, say, the House members. Let's say serve 4 terms. That's 8 years. Mm-hmm. What that does is it means that the process of governance is going to be looked at more frequently by experts outside of government, and that's what you need to regulate people in the legislature. In the same way, the bureaucracy doesn't rotate very fast either. And one of my suggestions is you should rotate the professionals out of a particular ministry and into another one. They shouldn't be able to stay, because the skill set of writing regulation, writing the rules is still the same set.
That's an interesting
idea. And people can learn the particulars of a certain department. For example, suppose you're not a petroleum expert and you started out, in the Commerce Department. Well, you understand something about commercial activities, so you will have to learn something about petroleum. Look, it's not impossible. I started out in the meat business and wound up in the petroleum business, so I learned a whole set of skills because it was advantageous for me to make the move. And there's no reason that we can't begin to think about our bureaucrats as people who learn. Look, the big theme today is human capital. People get rewarded for acquiring human capital. They can acquire it on the job. They can acquire it in their education. But a company that doesn't train its people and doesn't constantly upgrade them is a company that's doomed to fail. And we know that. So you will find today all kinds of examples in the market where CEOs are making sure their people are training and upgraded. It's not because they believe in some social policy that they want to do good for people. They do it because it's advantageous economically.
And also because things are changing so rapidly.
Right.
Technology, information.
Well, what this does is if you rotated people
Yes.
in the bureaucracy, you'd have much more concern, you'd have much more visibility, you'd have much more transparency, and you would have accountability. And it wouldn't be just a closed shop regulated by the civil service administrators. Right now, it's very difficult to discharge somebody for a lack of performance. And that shouldn't be the case. I mean, there's no reason to think that an administrator in the health services department or in commerce or in agriculture should be permanently protected if their performance is poor.
Now, what about the dissonance between the ordinary voter and government? All over the world now, people are dissatisfied with their governments.
Well, I think that what you're seeing is that we as people all over the world want government to do things for us that we seem unable to do for ourselves. This is a huge change. It came, the big change was the Great Depression and the notion of Social Security and the notion that government is responsible and so on. But what has happened, and we see it in, for example, the European Union, we put all the bureaucrats in Brussels. Well, now people feel distant. They don't know what they don't know anybody in the Brussels regulation system. There's, what does the guy in Hungary or in Poland who's operating a small shop know about what's going on in Brussels? So you have an alienation. You have an alienation of people and from their governments. Brexit is just one example, but we saw it in Australia, we saw it in East Europe, we've seen it all throughout Europe, where there's a distancing because government is too far away. Its regulations are constructed by people that voters don't know at all. So I think that size, the size of government, that is the scope of its actions, is so much larger in the 21st century than it has been in the 20th and 19th, that people feel very alienated from the government. And you see it in the voting patterns. You see, why did the polls get it so wrong in 2016? They all got it wrong. Well, because people were dissatisfied. And enough of them went to the polls and said, I want change. Now, whether the change that they thought they were going to get, whether they got that change, I don't know. Well, I guess we'll find out a little bit over the next month or so. But you can't make democratic republics untransparent. They have to be seen through. People have to understand what they're doing. And as we get more education, that's what really is in demand. And I think it's no different than what happened in corporate governance. We wanted accountability, we wanted transparency, and we're getting much better at it. We don't have the number of frauds we used to have. If you go back in the 19th century, when we had public markets, we had a lot of fraud. It happened every day. So regulation helps if the regulation is good regulation, if it creates the right incentives. Regulation hinders if it slows down economic growth. Those are the sort of the paradigm you have to work between. And one of the professors at the University of Chicago Department of Economics, who was an advisor to Trump as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, has written a very interesting book called You're Hired. It's a kind of play on Trump's old program. but it shows what happened when they deregulated. It took off some 6,000 or 7,000 regulations, and we got a growth spurt. Now, many economists, maybe not the majority, but many think that the real reason for the growth spurt was not monetary and fiscal policy, but was taking off some of the regulations.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the curve of regulations over time, it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking. It's just straight up. And that's not necessarily a good thing for the economy. And it's not very good for individual voters. I mean, you're told what kind of a car you have to buy. You're told the kind of mask you have to wear. It's not a good idea. You know, one man's meat is another's poison. And we have to worry a little bit about trying to govern from top to down below. Down below is the mass of people. When we govern from the top, we often don't see what they really need or what they really are willing to put up with.
Well, I don't see how you're going to get transparency because government is so complex, and as you said, they are far away.
Well, you get transparency by institutionalizing it, by making the government tell you what it's doing. We've had some grievous examples over this administration about not knowing what the government was doing. I mean, whether you call the investigations of the Trump administration correct or incorrect, one thing we know, there was a lot more information that we didn't have. And, you know, it comes out, unfortunately, in a political context, but it should have come out earlier. It should have come out right from the beginning. And that's also true about investigations. I think one of the things that, for example, is I'll give you an example of non-transparency. I'm a Californian by birth. I had a property which is now in a fire area. But I always had a war with the public utilities in that area because they didn't do anything about their towers and they didn't bury their electrical lines. And it was very obvious to me that when you short out a 40,000 volt line, you start a forest fire. So PG&E, which was the monopoly carrier in our area, was terrible about this. And we created a liability. And it's not an accident, by the way, that a public utility, a highly regulated public utility, did this. Why? Because they're the ones who are on the firing line between the regulator and themselves. They know the regulator far better than you as the consumer. I had a lot of trouble installing a big cell system, you know, and they didn't want to buy the power from me. Why?
Because then you wouldn't be buying from them.
Well, you know, I was contributing power, and that wasn't in their interest. But I think that, for example, that one of the reasons we have so many of these fires is because of unburied lines. Now, suppose the regulators had said over the last 40 years, you have to bury your lines. We don't want forest fires.
They can still say it.
Well, you would have had a lot less of them.
Yeah.
But, you know, they don't look long term.
One of the things that bothers me is that your boards who bury information from shareholders, from even board members, they don't want board members to know about corruption or self-dealing, so they don't let the board member know.
Well, I have a suggestion for that one.
Go on.
You have to make the board members liable.
Yes.
And if you make them liable, then they become advocates for the shareholders because they don't want to have the liability attached to them. Now, the argument you get from people who don't like that kind of approach is, well, we'll never be able to get board members. And I say that's nonsense. We have literally thousands of young analysts and in the market who are very good at risk management. That's what they do. That's what they're trained to do. So they'll love jobs like this. I also think that the corporations shouldn't be paying for their D&O insurance. I think the board members should pay for it. It's a job. You get paid for doing the job.
The civic members should be paying for their own insurance.
Absolutely. Now, that will mean that the compensation of board members will go up. But you want it to go up because you want to attract better people. See, I think shareholders are willing to pay for that.
Well, I also think that there should not be such thing as the business judgment rule, where it's felt that any board member or manager can do anything because he has the right to err.
Well, again, you wouldn't have that business judgment impact if you had liability. See, you want to turn the director not as to be a spokesman for the shareholder, not a spokesman for the board, not a spokesman for the management. That's what you really need to change. And when you do that, managers become more alert. Let me just say one other thing here about that I have observed and I think is really a good thing. In the fallout from 2001 and 2001 and 2007 and 8, many boards put in their compensation agreements clawbacks, and they also wrote longer vesting period for stock options. Now, the stock option itself is a direct consequence of bad financial legislation. You use the stock option because it has very good capital gains characteristics. But if you have good regulation, good incentives, you have long vesting periods for those options. Well, what that does is it's very interesting. The CEO and the CFO don't last very long anymore. They're not 40-year members of management. Maybe they go 8 years or 10 years or 12 years. Well, when that happens, that they have long vesting periods, they have to worry about the people coming behind them taking too much risk on the company and creating a disaster which wipes out their options. So they're going to pay attention to the quality of people coming up the ladder. And I'll give you the perfect counterexample was Enron. Enron had a ranking system, which was termed in the literature rank and yank. Every quarter they ranked all of the traders. The ones that made a lot of money got promoted. The ones who didn't make any money got fired. Well, think about what happens if you turn that wheel every quarter for 10 years. You wind up with traders who are all great big risk takers.
That's right.
Okay. That's why Enron really collapsed.
It's not a question of keeping, what's wrong with having the same amount of profit from year to year?
I'm sorry.
What's wrong with having the same amount of profit over 2 years or 3 years? Why do you have to do it? Increase the profit every year.
Well, the market pays for growth. There's no question of that. But what you should care about as a shareholder is having enough information to make a judicious choice about the risks that corporation is taking. So it's the lack of disclosure that I care about. I don't mind if shareholders decide they want to buy into a risky venture, as long as they're well informed about what the risks are. Now, if you change the compensation arrangements and you change the liability arrangements of the board, you'll get more accurate current information and shareholders can make better decisions. It's not wrong for a shareholder to lose money. It's wrong if he loses money because the information that he needed wasn't available. To me, that's the key thing. And I think the same rule applies in government. It's not wrong for the government to legislate in a certain area. It's wrong to conceal what the impact of that legislation is.
Interesting. Yeah. Now, what points do you think our public should take away with them that you have covered? What points do you think the general public should take away with them? What should they? What do you want them to remember from what you've said?
Well, what I'm saying, what I think the public needs to know is, why did the legislation get written the way it got written, and what information is available for the public to make a judgment about who influenced the legislation having the direction that it took. And, if you watch the debates or you watch the arguments, it's just it's a lesson in being obscure. I mean, the amount of there's no moderator who says that's not true. If you watched the debate the other night, you saw this happen all the time. One party said one thing, and the other one said, no, that's not true at all. Well, there's no resolution. What is the voter going to think? I think that the press has played a poor role. The media has played a poor role in the information gathering business. They're more interested in what the outcome is rather than the process.
How about they're having access to information? They're having access. They're afraid of not having access.
That's
walking through
absolutely
the door.
correct. You don't insult the person you want to interview because you won't be able to get an interview. And to me, we've failed in that area. I don't know how to correct the media on that one. My hope is the internet will ultimately correct it, strangely enough, by publishing information which is not widely disseminated through the large media. But maybe not. Maybe it won't happen.
How will we be able to get information about who is influencing vital legislation?
Well, in many ways, the private sector, the corporate world, gets that information. They get it through their lobbyists. But we have an inadequacy in the public lobby, in the business of providing the public with the information that the lobbyists have. So.
Bernie, I want to thank you so much for coming back on our show.
Okay. Well,
It's been a great pleasure to have you.
It was fun to be here.
This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.